So we're continuing our series on the story of Joseph. Last week Joseph came out of prison, and so things are looking up for him right now because he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams.
Yes, and Pharaoh was so delighted with this that he made Joseph prime minister over the whole of Egypt. That was a pretty big promotion for a guy who'd just been dragged out of prison.
Doesn't get much bigger than that, really.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. And Kevin is now going to read the next part of the story to us from the Bible.
This morning's reading is taken from Genesis chapter 41, verses 37 to 57. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning or as wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it onto Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, "Make way!" Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, but without your word no one will lift hand or foot in all Egypt." Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphenath-Paneah and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potipherah, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and travelled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potipherah, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim and said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began. Just as Joseph had said, there was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph and do what he tells you." When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians. For the famine was severe throughout Egypt, and all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe everywhere. Thanks be to God.
So let's explore how Joseph got stuck into life in Egypt. God partnered with Joseph to save the Egyptians, to bring God's rescue plan, the hope of food when there was going to be famine. You can partner with God and get stuck in where you are to bring God's rescue plan, Jesus, the hope, the good news, the life, the purpose, wherever you are. I can imagine that you, perhaps like many people, want to be like Joseph, making a difference with God where you are. Well, the encouragement is that you can. Well, you may not be Prime Minister, or you might, but when God partners with you, you can do wonderful things wherever you are to help people discover Jesus, to feel the benefits of life with Jesus, and to meet with him. Now, you might be looking at Joseph and thinking, his life was so different from mine. But actually, it was incredibly similar. It was similar in 4 ways. The first way Joseph's life was similar to yours is that he was amongst people who had a different faith. I can imagine that your university or your workplace, your family perhaps, or your neighbourhood is a place where there aren't many people following Jesus. Of course, there may be, but typically you'll be in a situation where not many people follow Jesus. Well, Joseph was amongst a whole nation who didn't follow his God, who didn't even know his God. At your primary school or secondary school, you may have remembered studying about all the Egyptian gods. Well, that was the Egypt that Joseph found himself in. So he was amongst people like you who worshipped different gods. He was amongst the people who had different standards. Because the Egyptians worshipped all those different gods, and we've said in previous talks, gods don't have to be things that you bow down and worship. They could be things like worshipping wealth or relationships or experiences. Because Joseph was amongst people who worshipped different gods, they had different standards and values. Some of them would have been similar, but in key areas, they would have been very different. You'll be amongst people who have different standards and values to you because they're worshipping different gods. They're not following Jesus. So he was amongst people who had different faith. He was amongst people who had different standards. He was also amongst people who had a different culture to his. Joseph was an Israelite. He was amongst Egyptians. In those days, cultural differences were even more defined than they are today. In fact, Egyptians wouldn't actually sit next to Israelites to eat with them. You may be amongst people who have different cultural background to you, different education, different wealth background, different language, different leisure pursuits, different sort of purposes in life, different ethnicity. So Joseph was amongst people who had a different faith, amongst people who had different standards, and amongst people who had a different culture. And then Joseph had a secular role. He wasn't playing an overtly spiritual role. Yes, he was Prime Minister, but he was involved in the nuts and bolts of everyday life. And I can imagine that you don't have an overtly spiritual role, perhaps as a parent or a work colleague or business owner or friend or family member. And so you'll be similar to Joseph. So Joseph was amongst people with different faith, different standards, different culture, and he was playing a secular role, probably like you. But because Joseph loved God, he loved the people that God loved. And we know that God loved the whole world. And so Joseph gets stuck in. He gives himself to the Egyptians and he works for their good. He reveals God's rescue plan to them. And as we said all through this series, Joseph points to Jesus. You see, when Jesus came to earth, many people expected that he would limit his help to his own people. Jesus was Jewish, and the Israelites believed that Jesus came just for the Jews, just for the Israelites. Well, he did come for the Jews and the Israelites, but he came for everybody else as well. It was said that Jesus was a light for the Gentiles, just as Joseph was helping people from different nations. Now, that's both a challenge and an encouragement. It's a challenge because if we're following Jesus, we'll get stuck in wherever we are. There may be people with different faith, different standards, different culture, and we may be doing an everyday role. But God says, I want to partner with you to show my love to those people, to point them to my rescue plan in Jesus. But it's an encouragement because just as Jesus found him in a world with people of different faith, different standards, different culture, and doing everyday things, secular jobs, he demonstrated that God's rescue plan, God's new life in him could flourish and thrive in that environment. And often people were surprised at those who turned to Jesus, people that everybody else said, oh, we'll write those people off. They'll never turn to God. And when Jesus got stuck in and got close to them, they did. Well, I'm going to hand over to Carl in a minute, who's going to give some very practical advice on how you can now get stuck in, wherever you are, how you can partner with God and Be like Jesus in your environment. Bring the blessings, the grace, the goodness of Jesus in the place where you are, and how you can point to Jesus, God's rescue plan. So over to you, Carl.
We've just read Genesis chapter 41, verses 37 to 41. And I'm hoping to illustrate how God partnered with Joseph to serve the people of Egypt, but also how he can partner with us today. Now, up until this point in the story, God has been teaching Joseph and preparing him for the role of Prime Minister in Egypt. I think it's important to note that God teaching often involves us struggling. Joseph faced struggles through his life up until now. Remember, he was sold into slavery by his own brothers, and he was falsely accused and sent to prison. It's easy to be faithful when life is easy, but Joseph perseveres through the hard times and proves he is a faithful man. We've just read in our passage, after that long struggle, God gives Joseph favour in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all Pharaoh's servants. God makes Joseph the Prime Minister of Egypt, and Joseph is given authority. He's given a gold chain, a signet ring, and fine clothing to show this. But what does all that have to do with us today? We've been reading from the Old Testament of the Bible. In the New Testament, Jesus speaks as if he is speaking to us today. And of course he is. Now, just as God rewarded Joseph with authority, Jesus also gives you authority. In Luke chapter 10, verse 19, he says, "Behold, I give you authority." And then he goes on. Jesus might not have given us a gold chain and fine clothing, but he does give us power to impact the lives of people around us in a positive way. We will come back to that point in just a moment. Just like Joseph persevered through his struggle, if we endure with Christ, if we stick by him and wait for him, he will give us that same authority to make a positive impact on whatever situation we are in. The Apostle Paul wrote, "If we endure with him, we will also reign with him." That perseverance could be needed at home, at work, or wherever we find ourselves. It's through the small struggles we go through, as well as the bigger problems. We might not be called to be the Prime Minister of a country like Joseph, but we are still called to be examples of the Christian faith in our homes, in our workplaces, and in our own communities, even when sometimes that's not the easy option. But we don't know how significant each faithful effort is and who might notice it. Joseph wasn't expecting anything in return when he gave godly advice to Pharaoh, but it was that faithful act that got him noticed. Well, that's the scripture side of things, but how does this spiritual authority look in real life? Well, for me personally, I work for a company that installs garage doors, and I enjoy that very much. But things haven't always been smooth in my job. Just over a couple of years ago, I planned to leave my job because I decided it wasn't for me. There were too many things that I didn't get on with at the time. Now, around about the time I was thinking about leaving my job, I'd just begun coming to church. This was a couple of years ago. And you, as the church, advised me to persevere in my job and to be ready to speak godly wisdom into the situation if it were needed. Now, I don't think I got everything right, but I tried to follow that advice as best as I could. And I still work here. My relationships with the people in the company have improved greatly by just persevering and trying to work out the problems. And because of all of that, I'm trusted with more responsibility with handling customers and handling stock and taking a greater role in helping the company to move forward. You might say that's a smaller version of the Joseph story in real life, partnering with God, persevering and being trusted with greater responsibility. It's an illustration, I guess, of how we can partner with God to make a change. There are things that can prevent us from fully partnering with God. It can be a fear of failure. Although God will not fail, we still worry about it. It can be difficult to trust him, especially if we're new to this. As a new Christian, it can be quite daunting to trust God with our troubles for the first time. We don't know really what's going to happen. And it's just not natural. We like to do things ourselves. My personal struggle is that I might ask someone for help, but then I interfere with them as they work, trying to fix my problem, because even though I've asked for help in my mind, I still think that I know best, or perhaps that person that's helping me doesn't quite know what they're doing. And we can do that with God too. God can be trying to help us, but we aren't quite ready to let go of that situation long enough for him to finish his work. If there's one thing I'd like you to take away from this talk, it's that the more we practice and the more we endure with God, the more we learn to trust him, and the more we trust in God, the more he entrusts to us.
Carl, thank you so much. Really helpful, and thanks for sharing that story from your own workplace about the way God partnered with you. Now, I'd like you to think, how is God wanting to partner with you in where you are? How can you get stuck in? And as always, I'm going to encourage you to write something down. We know that when we write something down, we're far more likely to do it. It shows a measure of intent and commitment. So the first thing I'd like you to write down is, what challenge are you facing in the world that you find yourself in? Okay, and now you've written down that challenge. How do you sense God is calling you to respond to that challenge? Carl shared about how God led him to respond to the challenge he faced. You may not have an exact idea, you may just be beginning to think it through, but how do you sense God's wanting to grow you in that challenge? And how do you sense God's wanting to partner with you to bring his love, his life, to point to Jesus in that challenge you're facing? So if you've got those written down, that's great, because now you can pray about them. You may be in a DG group, you may have a friend that you can pray with, maybe you just want to pray on your own to start with. But be praying about those things. And Carl encouraged you, didn't he, to persevere. The Bible encourages us to persevere. It may be that God's partnership with you is different from how you expected. God's partnership with Joseph was completely different to how Joseph expected. The way that Jesus walked to the cross and rose again was completely different from what people expected. But that same power that raised Jesus Christ from the grave is at work in you. God can partner with you to grow you and to do wonderful things in the place where you are, to point people to Jesus and to bring the life and the renewal of Jesus to the family, university, workplace, neighbourhood, friendship group that you are in. That's really encouraging, isn't it? So get stuck in with God. Let him partner with you and do wonderful things wherever you are. Can I pray for you and me now? Jesus, thank you that you can enable us to bloom wherever we're planted, to flourish as we get stuck in. I pray that all the challenges that people have shared with you and written down, Lord, that you would be growing them through those. Not only that, but as they respond to whatever it is they sense you calling them to do, that the people around them may see your new life in Jesus Christ. And I pray that for us praying these prayers, we're going to be surprised at what you've done through us as you partner with us as we get stuck in. Amen. So thank you, so good to be with you. And like Joseph, let's get stuck in with Jesus and partner with God wherever we are.
So we now invite you to take part in communion with us today, the Lord's Supper, or some of you may know this as Mass, depending on which church background you come from. This would be a great time to find your bread, if you haven't already done so, or your bread substitute, and your wine or wine substitute, and to get that ready for communion. And whatever church background you're from, we invite you to take part in communion with us. If you are somebody who follows Jesus, if you're somebody who doesn't know Jesus, doesn't follow Jesus, that's absolutely fine. But we wouldn't necessarily encourage you to join in communion with us. But you might want to take this time to think about who Jesus is, how he lived, how he died, how he rose again. There is a verse in the Bible that I'd like to read to you, which you might find helpful to reflect on in this time. And it says this, it says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come and eat with them, and they with me." So Jesus, if you like, is knocking on the door, and he's saying, come in and eat with me. That's what he is offering you today. And you might like to take him up on that offer and say, yes, I'd love you to come in.
And so we turn now to the meal that Jesus prepares for us. We think about the bread. Joseph fed the Egyptians and saved their lives by storing up grain. Of course, you can eat bread and you'll be hungry again. It won't stop you from dying. You need something more satisfying. That's why Jesus said, "I am the bread of life. Whoever eats of me will never go hungry." As Jesus gave his life for yours, so he gives you his eternal life. As you eat the bread, can I ask you to reflect on how much you're nourishing yourself from him? How much are you allowing him to satisfy you? Are you allowing other things to sort of be a substitute satisfaction instead of Jesus? Can I encourage you as you eat the bread to feed richly off him? Let him be the one who nourishes your life and soul. And then we come to the wine. Jesus said, "This is the blood, my blood poured out for you." Jesus' blood renews us and gives us life. Can I encourage you as you take the wine to consider not only how Jesus is renewing you, but in the sense that his blood is poured out, how is his life being poured out where you are? How are you partnering with Jesus to allow him to get stuck in where you are? Can I encourage you as you drink the wine to consider and pray about the renewal of wherever you find yourself, family, workplace, school, university, neighbourhood. And let's be open in allowing Jesus to surprise us. You don't know who will respond to Jesus' blood. And can I ask you to be open and flexible in allowing Jesus to pour out his life-giving blood to not only you, but those people in the context in which you live and work. Just before we eat the bread and take the wine, I can imagine many of us would like to take a moment to just say sorry to God for maybe not allowing Jesus to be our ultimate satisfaction, for times when we have not allowed God to renew us or allowed his renewing grace to be working through us. Let's take a moment to pray, shall we? Jesus, thank you for giving us your life, that this bread symbolises, and your blood, that this wine symbolises. Jesus, we are sorry, really sorry, for allowing other things to satisfy us more than you, for not being gracious as you are gracious, for being loving, not being loving as you are loving. We are sorry for all those times when we've not shown your grace, your kindness, your love. Will you forgive us? Amen.
Amen.
We can be confident that if we've asked God for forgiveness, he forgives all those with a truly repentant heart.
Amen. Amen. And whilst we are taking the bread and wine in our homes, wherever we are, we will have a collage showing up on the screen of many of the people in the church, pictures of many of the people in the church family. And we hope that this will encourage you and help us to feel even more a family in this very unusual time. And as well as having that collage, Renato is going to be playing a piece, a duet for us on his flute. And the particular piece that he is going to be playing is called Master, the Tempest is Raging. And that's quite an apt title actually for this time that we're in. But very encouragingly, the chorus says this in the lyrics. It says, "The wind and the waves shall obey thy will. Peace, be still."
What great words, and it's lovely to have that creative talent to be able to share amongst us. So please now, as we listen to the music and see one another in photos, let's join with one another through Jesus Christ as we eat the bread and drink the wine.